The Zenthar Academy of Practical Sciences occupied 3 orbital platforms above the garden world of Keeper's Point, and for the past 4 centuries it had maintained its reputation as the finest survival training institution in the known galaxy. Students traveled from 1,200 member worlds to learn the ancient arts their ancestors had abandoned in favor of climate-controlled habitats and matter replicators. The Academy's philosophy was simple: technology fails, environments change, but the knowledge of how to survive with nothing but your appendages and whatever materials nature provided, that was eternal. Professor Thrixnell had been teaching Primitive Competency 301 for 67 standard years, and in that time he had watched generation after generation of soft, overly civilized young beings struggle to reconnect with the survival instincts their species had spent millennia evolving beyond. He was a keeper, a crystalline species whose ancestors had literally grown their cities from living rock. His people never forgot their roots, which made him particularly insufferable about everyone else's technological dependencies. The course requirement was brutal in its simplicity. Students would be deposited on one of 17 designated wilderness preserve worlds, with nothing but the clothes on whatever they used for backs, and they had 72 hours to construct shelter adequate to survive evaluation. No tools, no materials except what occurred naturally on the planet, no communication devices, no emergency rations. The only concession to modern safety was a subcutaneous beacon that would extract them if they were about to die, which also meant automatic failure. Thrixnell stood before his class of 42 students, his crystalline form refracting the lecture hall's lighting into judgmental rainbows across their nervous faces. The class represented the usual spread of galactic diversity: 3 Vordian quadrupeds, whose ancestors had burrowed complex tunnel systems, a pair of Helixian atmospheric beings who technically didn't need shelter but were required to build one anyway, 6 Kresh, whose exoskeletons made them natural architects, a dozen Tanish, whose flexible physiology let them squeeze into spaces that would crush most species, and an assortment of others, each convinced their particular evolutionary advantages would give them an edge. Then there was Marcus Webb, the human. Marcus sat in the back row, appearing to pay attention while actually running calculations about log-to-structure ratios in his head. He was 23 standard years old, compact and sturdy in the way humans tended to be, with brown skin, dark hair that never quite stayed in place, and the kind of quiet confidence that most species mistook for either stupidity or meditation. He was the first human to enroll in Zenthar Academy in 15 years, largely because humanity was still considered a backwater species that had only achieved faster-than-light travel through what the galactic community politely called enthusiastic improvisation, and what everyone else called terrifying disregard for safety protocols. The prevailing wisdom about humans was that they were persistence predators with decent endurance, but no natural advantages, no claws, no armor, no venom, no environmental adaptations worth mentioning. They were pink or brown, or somewhere in between. They broke easily, and they seemed to have survived their evolutionary gauntlet through sheer stubbornness and an alarming willingness to eat things that would kill most other species. The assignment, Thrixnell announced, his voice resonating like wind through a crystal cave, is not merely to survive. Survival is the minimum expectation. You will construct shelter that demonstrates understanding of structural integrity, environmental awareness, and resource management. I will arrive at dawn on the 4th day to evaluate your work. Those whose shelters are inadequate will fail. Those who activate their emergency beacons will fail. Those who attempt to use any modern technology will fail and face academic disciplinary action. A Kresh student raised one of her 6 limbs. Professor, what constitutes adequate shelter? Protection from the elements, evidence of planning rather than panic, demonstration that you could, if necessary, survive in such conditions for an extended period. His faceted eyes swept across the room. Your ancestors built civilizations before they had molecular assemblers and gravitational manipulation. You should be able to construct a simple dwelling. Marcus made a note on his data pad. Beside him, a tannish student named Quillix stretched nervously. What about those of us from species that evolved in radically different environments? I'm from a methane-based ecosystem. Then you will learn to adapt, which is the entire point of this exercise. Thrixnel's attention drifted to Marcus, and his tone acquired an edge that could have cut through bulkhead plating. And what about you, human? I trust you understand that your species' reputation for making dough will not earn you any additional consideration. The standards are the same for everyone. Marcus looked up, meeting the professor's gaze without flinching. Understood, sir. Same standards. Good, because I have reviewed human survival capabilities, and I must say, I am not impressed. No natural tools, no environmental resistances, no structural adaptations for construction. You will need to work considerably harder than your classmates to achieve even a passing grade. There was a ripple of amusement through the class. Marcus just smiled, which several students found unsettling for reasons they couldn't quite articulate. Humans had an unnerving way of smiling when things were about to get interesting. The following morning, 42 students stood in the shuttle bay wearing simple cloth garments and expressions ranging from determination to poorly concealed terror. They were being deployed to Wilderness Preserve 7, a temperate forest moon orbiting a gas giant in the Kellyan system. The moon featured dense coniferous forests, numerous freshwater sources, moderate temperature fluctuations, and a weather system that was, in the Academy's careful phrasing, characteristically unpredictable. The creche students were already discussing their plans to weave elaborate structures from branches and plant fibers. The Vordians intended to dig shelters and cover them with forest debris. The Helixians had no idea what they were going to do and were questioning their life choices. Marcus stood quietly, running through a mental checklist that would have looked extremely familiar to any human who had ever been to summer camp or watched historical documentaries about frontier life. Shuttle deployment was done individually to prevent collaboration. Each student was dropped at a different location within a 100-kilometer radius, far enough apart that they wouldn't encounter each other but close enough that environmental conditions remained consistent. Monitoring drones would record everything for later review and grading. Marcus was deposited in a clearing beside a fast-moving stream, surrounded by tall trees that looked remarkably similar to earth pines and hemlocks. The shuttle departed with a rush of displaced air, and he was alone. He stood still for 5 minutes, just observing wind direction and consistency, temperature, humidity, the angle of sunlight through the canopy, the types of vegetation, the sound of water, which told him about flow rate and depth, the distant rumble that might have been weather systems forming over the mountains to the west. Most of the other students, visible on the monitoring feeds that Thrixnel was reviewing back at the Academy, immediately began gathering materials in a frenzy of activity. Marcus walked the perimeter of his area for an hour, examining soil composition, testing bark for water content, checking which direction offered the best drainage and wind protection. He found a slight rise about 30 meters from the stream, elevated enough to avoid flooding, but close enough for easy water access, with natural wind breaks from the surrounding forest. Then he started selecting trees. This was where human evolutionary history diverged sharply from most spacefaring species. While other civilizations had moved from caves to cities to orbital habitats in relatively smooth progressions, often skipping the intermediate steps entirely as they traded technological advances with other species. Humans had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of turning trees into homes. Timber framing, log construction, joinery techniques that required no metal fasteners. Entire cultures had built massive wooden structures that stood for centuries, and all that collective knowledge was still taught in schools, preserved in historical records, and practiced by enthusiasts who considered it a relaxing weekend hobby. Marcus didn't need advanced knowledge. He just needed to remember what his grandfather had taught him during summers at the cabin in Oregon. He selected trees that were straight, relatively uniform in diameter, and showed signs of being dead or dying. No point in killing healthy trees when nature provided plenty of suitable alternatives. Using a sharp stone he'd found near the stream, and a piece of harder rock as a hammer, he fashioned a crude axe by hafting the blade to a sturdy branch, using strips of inner bark soaked and twisted into cordage. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. The monitoring feeds showed other students weaving branches together, or piling stones, or attempting to bend saplings into dome shapes. Marcus was felling trees. By the end of day 1, he had 8 logs delimbed and dragged to his building site. The creche students had elaborate partial frameworks that looked impressive but questionable in terms of weather resistance. The Vordians had decent burrows but no roofs. Most others had managed rudimentary lean-tos or debris huts that might keep light rain off but wouldn't survive anything serious. Marcus had a foundation layout, with rocks positioned to keep his logs off the ground and prevent rot. He'd also built a small lean-to for himself to sleep in, because he wasn't going to spend 3 nights uncomfortable when he could spend 1 hour building temporary shelter. Day 2 was when things got interesting. Marcus cut notches into the ends of his logs, using his stone tools, creating interlocking corners that would hold without fasteners. It was slow work, and his hands acquired blisters that his grandfather would have mocked him for, but the corners fit together with satisfying precision. He laid logs in alternating directions, building up walls that were actually straight and stable. He positioned the structure so the door would face east, away from the prevailing western weather, and left gaps for a proper entrance and smoke hole. Other students, watching through the monitoring system during their breaks, began to take notice. What the human was building looked less like survival shelter and more like actual architecture. "Is he allowed to do that?" one creche student asked. "He's only using natural materials and no tools except ones he made," another pointed out. "It follows the assignment parameters." "Yes, but that's a building. We're supposed to make shelter." "A building is shelter." He's just overachieving. By midday on day 2, Marcus had 4 walls approximately 2 meters high, creating an internal space of roughly 3 by 4 meters. He'd selected logs for rafters, notched them to sit securely on the walls, and was beginning to layer smaller branches across them to create a roof support structure. He covered this with large sections of bark he'd carefully removed from fallen trees, overlapping them like shingles to shed water. Over the bark he packed a thick layer of moss and forest duff for insulation. The monitoring feeds became must-watch content back at the academy. Students who had already completed their own shelters gathered in the common areas to watch the human work with the methodical focus of someone following a process so ingrained it was practically instinctual. Faculty members drifted by to observe, making notes and exchanging glances that ranged from impressed to concerned. Professor Thrixnell watched with mounting disbelief as Marcus mixed mud from the stream bank with grass and pine needles to create chinking, which he packed between the logs to seal gaps. The human had built a fireplace inside the structure, using flat stones arranged to contain fire safely, with a chimney made from progressively smaller stones that vented through a carefully positioned opening in the roof. He'd even created a raised sleeping platform using split logs, keeping him off the cold ground. "This is unexpected," Thrixnell admitted to his teaching assistant, a young keeper named Zenthar, who was taking notes for his own eventual teaching career. "He's making it look easy," Zenthar observed. "Should building shelter be that easy? For humans, apparently it is." Thrixnell's crystalline structure darkened slightly, which was his species' equivalent of a frown. "I may need to revise the syllabus." The weather system that had been forming over the western mountains arrived on the evening of day 2, earlier than forecasted, and with considerably more enthusiasm than the meteorological models had predicted. Rain began as scattered drops that quickly escalated into a torrential downpour, driven by winds that bent trees and turned the monitoring feeds into blurred chaos. Emergency beacons started activating across the preserve. Lean-tos collapsed. Debris huts dissolved into soggy piles of leaves. The carefully woven branch structures of the creche students, which had looked so impressive in fair weather, came apart under the sustained assault of wind and rain. Even the Vordian burrows, which should have been relatively secure, began flooding as the ground saturated. Marcus sat inside his cabin, feeding small branches to the fire in his stone fireplace, watching smoke curl up through the chimney and out into the storm. The cabin was completely weatherproof. Rain hammered against the bark roof and slid off in sheets, running down the walls and away from the foundation. The chinking between logs held firm, with only a few places where dampness seeped through, and he'd already identified those spots for repair in the morning. The raised sleeping platform kept him dry and comfortable. The fire provided warmth and light. He pulled out a piece of dried fish he'd caught and smoked on day 1, because of course he'd taken time to secure food. Another thing his grandfather had emphasized, and ate dinner while the storm raged outside. Through gaps in the logs, he could see lightning illuminating the forest in stark flashes. Wind howled through the trees with a sound like freight trains. This was the kind of storm that would have been genuinely dangerous without proper shelter. His cabin didn't even creak. By morning, 16 students had activated their emergency beacons and been extracted. Another 8 had shelters so damaged they were essentially starting over. The remaining students, including Marcus, had survived the night, though most looked considerably worse for wear when the monitoring feeds updated at dawn. Marcus emerged from his cabin, stretched, checked the chimney for any debris that might have been blown in, and began making repairs to his chinking. He also cut a small sapling and fashioned a crude door, using twisted bark cordage to create hinges that would let it swing freely. It wasn't necessary for the assignment, but the overnight temperature had dropped, and the door would make the cabin more comfortable. Professor Thrixnell arrived on the morning of day 4 in a hover transport, accompanied by 3 evaluation committee members and a medical team on standby. The evaluation route took them to each surviving student's location in sequence, starting with the nearest and working outward. They assessed a reconstructed Vordian burrow, a tannish structure that resembled a cocoon woven from grass and vines, a creche shelter that had been extensively reinforced after the storm, and a handful of other efforts that met minimum standards with varying degrees of success. Then they arrived at Marcus's location. Thrixnell stepped out of the transport, prepared to find another rudimentary survival shelter, and instead found himself staring at what could only be described as a log cabin. Not a shelter, not a rudimentary structure. An actual cabin with straight walls, a properly pitched roof, a functioning chimney from which a thin trail of smoke rose into the morning air, and a door that swung on what appeared to be vine hinges. The professor stood in silence for a full 30 seconds, during which his crystalline structure cycled through several colors associated with confusion and cognitive dissonance. "This cannot be correct," he finally said. "Check the coordinates." Coordinates confirmed. Zenthar replied, consulting his datapad. This is the humans' designated area. But that's a cabin. That's a proper timber structure with functional architectural elements. Yes, sir. Marcus emerged from the cabin, looking relatively clean and well-rested considering he'd spent 3 days in the wilderness. Good morning, Professor. Ready for inspection. Thrixnel approached slowly, as if the structure might be a holographic projection that would dissolve upon contact. He examined the notched corners, the chinking, the bark-shingled roof, the stone fireplace visible through the open door. The construction quality wasn't just adequate, it was genuinely good, the kind of work that showed understanding of principles rather than lucky improvisation. Explain this, Thrixnel demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. You had no tools except what you could create from natural materials. No assistance, no prior knowledge of this environment. How did you construct something this sophisticated? Marcus blinked, genuinely confused by the question. Sir, this is just a basic log cabin. It's pretty simple construction actually. I probably could have done better with more time, but 72 hours doesn't leave much room for refinement. Simple. The word came out like an accusation. This demonstrates advanced understanding of joinery, weatherproofing, thermal management, and structural engineering. Well, yes, but it's all pretty basic human knowledge. We've been building log cabins for something like 10,000 years. Probably longer, but that's as far back as we have good archaeological evidence. Most of the early European settlements on North America were log construction. Also Russia, Scandinavia, parts of Asia, really anywhere humans had forests and needed housing. Marcus gestured to his cabin. This is actually simplified compared to traditional methods. I didn't dovetail the corners or use proper chinking materials or build a foundation that would last more than a season. This is more like what you'd build for a temporary hunting camp. The evaluation committee members were taking extensive notes. One of them, a Helixian named Vorash, who floated in a contained atmospheric bubble, spoke up. Are you saying this level of construction is normal for your species, for wilderness survival? Sure, I mean, not everyone knows how to do it, but it's pretty common knowledge. We teach basic woodcraft in schools, and there are thousands of historical sites and museums dedicated to traditional building techniques. Plus, reality entertainment shows about people building cabins in remote locations are really popular. Marcus paused. Is this not normal for other species? Most species, Thrixnel said slowly, his earlier hostility giving way to something that might have been academic curiosity, do not maintain detailed cultural knowledge of primitive construction techniques. When our civilizations advanced technologically, we left behind such methods in favor of superior building technologies. Oh, yeah. Humans didn't really do that. We kept building with wood and stone even after we had better options because, well, we like it. There's something satisfying about working with natural materials. Plus, trees are renewable, the construction techniques are sustainable, and wood buildings can last for centuries if properly maintained. We've got wooden temples in Japan that are over 1,000 years old. Marcus noticed their expressions, or the alien equivalents, and added, we also have a whole cultural tradition around the idea that modern technology can fail, so maintaining knowledge of how to survive and build without it is considered important. We call it bushcraft or wilderness survival, and it's a pretty popular hobby. Some people spend their vacations learning this stuff. You're telling me, Vorash said carefully, that humans voluntarily practice primitive survival techniques for recreation. Yeah, basically. We've got competitions and everything. There's one where people try to build shelters using only Stone Age technology, then live in them for a month. It's televised. Thrixnell was re-evaluating every assumption he'd made about humanity over the past 67 years. What else could you have built, given more time? Marcus considered the question. Well, with a week I could have added a proper foundation, maybe built some furniture, put in a window using a wood frame covered in oiled cloth or animal membrane. With a month and help, you could construct a full house with multiple rooms, a root cellar for food storage, possibly a separate building for workshops or storage. With a year and a community, you could build an entire village. That's literally how most human settlements started before industrialization. And you learned this where exactly? My grandfather taught me the basics when I was a kid. We used to build things together. Plus I took wilderness survival courses in secondary school, and I did a summer program on traditional building techniques because I thought it sounded interesting. Marcus shrugged. It's not that unusual for humans to know this stuff. The evaluation committee conferred briefly in low tones that the translators didn't pick up. Finally, Thrixnell turned back to Marcus, his crystalline structure showing resigned acceptance. Your shelter exceeds all evaluation criteria. You have demonstrated not merely survival capability but genuine mastery of primitive construction techniques. Your grade is exemplary. He paused, then added with obvious reluctance. The Academy would like to preserve this structure as a permanent exhibit demonstrating superior execution of the assignment parameters. Marcus grinned. Sure, that's fine. Should I leave the door? 3 days later, Marcus sat in the Academy's main lecture hall with the other surviving students, watching Professor Thrixnell announce revisions to the primitive competency curriculum. The course would now include prerequisite assessments of species-specific traditional knowledge, species with extensive historical construction practices, and here Thrixnell's gaze landed meaningfully on Marcus, would face additional challenges requiring them to use techniques outside their cultural background. The wilderness preserve assignments would be graded on a curve that accounted for evolutionary advantages and cultural technological development patterns. The purpose of this course, Thrixnell explained, is to push students beyond their comfort zones and teach survival skills their civilizations may have abandoned in favor of modern convenience. However, it has come to our attention that some species never abandoned such skills in the first place, which creates an unintentional but significant advantage. Quillix leaned over to Marcus and whispered, "You broke the curriculum. I built a cabin. You built a cabin that made everyone realize humans never stopped learning how to survive without technology, even after you had technology, which is apparently weird. Is it though? I mean, doesn't it make sense to keep the knowledge of how your ancestors survived just in case? To most species, just-in-case scenarios don't include technological collapse back to primitive conditions. We assume if something goes that wrong, we're probably doomed anyway." Marcus thought about human history, with its cycles of civilizations rising and falling, knowledge preserved and lost and rediscovered, and humanity's persistent habit of preparing for worst-case scenarios while hoping for the best. Yeah, I can see where our approaches might be a bit different. The following semester, the Academy added a new elective, Human Wilderness Survival Techniques. Marcus was asked to serve as a teaching assistant. His cabin became the most visited exhibit on campus, with students from dozens of species studying the construction methods and trying to understand how something so apparently simple could be so effective. Professor Thrixnell, for his part, developed a grudging respect for humanity's refusal to let go of their primitive survival knowledge. He revised his assessment of human capabilities from unimpressive to disturbingly competent at unexpected things, which he considered a significant upgrade. He also started teaching a unit on the importance of cultural knowledge preservation, using humanity as a case study in how maintaining connections to ancestral survival techniques could provide advantages in situations where more advanced species might struggle. The galaxy, it turned out, still had things to learn from species that never quite stopped being survivors, even after they learned to build starships. And somewhere on Wilderness Preserve 7, in a clearing beside a fast-moving stream, a small log cabin stood as a monument to the fact that some knowledge is worth keeping, no matter how advanced you become. Human survival instinct, it seemed, wasn't just about refusing to die. It was about remembering how not to die in the first place, and passing that knowledge down through generations until building a weatherproof shelter from raw trees in 72 hours was considered camping practice rather than an impressive feat of primitive engineering. The galaxy found this both fascinating and mildly terrifying, which was rapidly becoming humanity's brand.